I'd like to take a moment to share with you what I thought was an incredible conversation with one of my favorite clients. It's my hope that what I share with her is a help to you the way it was to her. She is 61 years old. She came to me initially and said, "Doc, I'm coming because I am ending a 34-year marriage that has been riddled with many challenges. And as heartbreaking as it is, after following your content regarding the value system and how we make decisions with those values, I came to the conclusion that it was the right decision." And she began to cry profusely, as one would imagine. I gave her a moment and I said, "Ma'am, sorry to hear this. Tell me about some of these challenges that you've had." She said, "Well, it's been riddled with infidelity. He cheated at least 6 times that she knew of. He actually had a child out of wedlock who is now 18 years old. She experienced insane levels of verbal abuse through her soon-to-be ex-husband." I said, "Do you all have any children together?" She said, "Yes, we have a 24 and a 27-year-old, and I also happen to have one grandchild." I said, "Well, what are your children's response to this life change that you're about to make at 61? She said, "They're both on board." She said, "When I had a conversation with them because he did not want to talk to them, I had a conversation with them after securing an attorney who is now in the process of filing the paperwork, or at least at the time of the call. He did not want to talk to the kids about it." I said, "Was he ever planning to?" He said, "No, he's always been avoidant in nature. He felt like they would just learn whenever they learn, just like anybody else, and he didn't want to inform anybody." Well, she said she took it upon herself to talk to them. I said, "What was their response?" She said they both looked at her and said, "What took you so long?" And she began to cry again on the call. I said, "Why are you crying now?" Just recounting that. She said, "Because I cried in front of them." And I said, "Do you want to explain why you did?" "I have an idea." She said, "Of course, Doc." She said, "I cried because it was really a sense of relief. I didn't need confirmation that I needed to be out of this bad marriage. I finally came to the realization after really focusing on my own self-awareness, my own honesty with me about who I am, where I am, and what I'm doing, and following your work, that this just wasn't healthy." And hearing them say that, though, did affirm my decision, and it felt well, and it felt good to hear that coming from my children. And I said to her, "I can totally understand where you're coming from." And I talk a lot about this in a video that I did about a past client on the burning house. And one of the things that people fail to realize is that children are far more resilient than what we give them credit for. Now, granted, your children are adults, you have a grandchild, but oftentimes people do stay in bad situations in the name of the children. It's a very common thing. Children and money, if I'm being frank with you, are typically the top 2 reasons, and religion maybe a tight third. But at the end of the day, kids are very resilient, and they tend to be able to bounce back much quicker than adults do. And even if your kids are adults, if those kids then also have had exposure over the years to all of these things that you two have experienced, they already knew what? She said that there were problems. I said, exactly. I said, so them saying that to you, I'm glad that it brought to you a sense of relief and more affirmation in knowing that you're making the right decision. She said, "Well, I believe I'm making the right decision, but if I'm being honest, Doc, I need you to help me work through a lot of what I call the what ifs and questioning if I made the right decision." And she said, "I know you're going to look at me strange after saying that, all the reasons why I'm doing this." She said, "But I actually have been going back and forth with myself, just asking myself a bunch of what ifs. What if I had done this differently?" Nobody's perfect in a marriage. That's something that she stated and admitted. Nobody's perfect, she said, "but Doc, I never cheated on him. I always honored him. If he had problems with me in any reasonable way, I tried to address them. When he was being verbally abusive, I would not address those problems because I didn't feel like those complaints came from a good place." She said, "But I always tried to honor my husband. And I'm sure there's some things I could have done better, but I never cheated 5, 6 times. I never did those things. And I'm just asking myself a lot lately, what if I could have done something different? What did I do wrong? What could I have done better?" And she began to cry. And I said, "Ma'am, don't beat yourself up over this." I said, "You're obviously, number one, asking yourself these questions because you're an amazing person. And it takes being an amazing person to have been cheated on that many times, have a child that was born out of wedlock, and you stayed through the verbal abuse and still yet look for a mirror to say, what could I have done better?" I said, that takes an amazing person. And so kudos to you for being that kind of person. I said, but what you're also doing is dabbling in a stage of grief that I think is underrated. I said, have you heard of the 5 stages of grief? She said, I have not. She grabs her pen. I said, well, stage 1 is denial, which is what it sounds like, denial. You deny that a situation is happening. And I made it clear to her that anytime we experience loss, we have to process grief. Grief is nothing more than loss. Grief is loss. And anytime we are experiencing grief, we are processing loss. And stage 1 is denial. Stage 2 is anger. It sounds like what it is. You get upset, frustrated, mad. More emotions that you experience because of the loss that you're having to process. Stage 3 is bargaining. And I told her, I said, I'll come back to that. Stage 4 is depression. It's not what people think it is in terms of medical depression, or the kind of depression that is signed off by a doctor. In the sense of grief, it just simply means deep sadness. And then I said to her, acceptance. We talked about how the stages don't necessarily have to go in order. I said, but let's talk about this stage called bargaining, because people that have heard of the stages of grief don't really understand what bargaining is. Bargaining is the phase that I call the scenario phase. She said, what do you mean by that, Doc? I said, it's the phase where you begin to ask yourself a bunch of questions. If I had done this differently, maybe the outcome would be different. Or what if I had done this? Or maybe I should have considered this. Or maybe I should have thought about doing this. We try to make a deal with ourselves to try to convince ourselves that there is something we could have done to either stop what has occurred, or there's something we can do to change what has occurred. It is something that we could have done to either stop what has occurred, or something that we could have done to change the outcome of what has occurred. She said, wow, that's powerful. I said, but let me tell you what is so crazy about this phase of grief. When people are in the bargaining phase of grief, this what if phase that has them trapped in the past and worried about the future, it keeps them from being where? She said, in the present. I said, and here's the problem, that anytime you're living in the past, you're living in the future, every what if you create in your mind creates an emotion attached to it. She said, Doc, say that again. I remember this so vividly and had it in my notes. I said, every what if scenario you create in your mind as a scenario of something you could have done different comes with it an emotion. If you say, well, what if I had been, for example, a wife that was more attentive? When you create that scenario in your mind, what accompanies that scenario is an emotion. And that emotion normally is good or bad. She said, it's normally bad. I said, why? She said, because it's attached to the past. I said, exactly. And it's also attached to the future. That you're saying that had you done such and such thing, had you had been a more attentive wife, then maybe he would not have cheated. Maybe you would still be married. But the problem with that is it creates a loop that keeps you in the bargaining phase. Many people don't realize that when you grieve, bargaining, the phase called bargaining tends to be the phase that I call the phase that keeps on giving. She started laughing. I said, if the reason why it keeps on giving is because for every what if you create in your mind, you create a negative emotion and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. What if I had done this? Negative emotion. What if I had done this? Negative emotion. What if I had said this? Negative emotion. What if I had changed this? Negative emotion. And you end up in this loop that keeps you where emotionally? High or emotionally down? She said emotionally down. I said, and ma'am, this is where you are. The reason why your mind can clearly say, based on the information clearly, he's cheated 5-6 times. He has had a baby out of wedlock. He's been verbally abusive. Your kids have affirmed the move and says that it makes sense, but you're still going back and forth saying what if, is because that phase of grief has you contending with the idea that there is something you could have done to stop it. And ma'am, I'm here to tell you, there is no what if scenario in your brain that you can create to stop what is experienced in your life. I said, and that's the deception of the bargaining phase. The deception of the bargaining phase is that the bargaining phase is designed to deceive you and have you think that there is something you could have done to either change what has occurred or to help you feel better about what has occurred. And the fact of the matter is, anytime we live in those what ifs, we end up creating emotions that do what? She said, that keeps us in the loop and keeps us in the phase. I said, exactly. I said, ma'am, this is simple. What we have to do is learn how to just lock into the present and realize that at the end of the day, there's nothing that we could have done. Though we could have been better in spaces, though there are things as humans, none of us are perfect, that you perhaps could have done better in the marriage. No doubt about that. But there's nothing that could have been done that has stopped what has already occurred. You cannot change the past and you cannot control the future. You only have control over one area of your life. I said, what is that, ma'am? She said, the present. I said, that's how we get out of the bargaining phase. We stop living in what ifs and we start focusing on the present. This is the task that is before me. I've been married for 34 years. I'm 61 years old. I have 2 adult children. I have a grandchild. And now I have to reset my life over and become the best version of myself for what I have remaining in my life here in the present. And I'm not going to go back and forth in my mind, replaying all of these scenarios of things that I should have done or could have done, or else I will be deceived to believe that part of his behavior is my fault, even deceived to believe that there's something I can say or do that could have changed it. And the reality is that's not our problem. We have to function in the present. And it was a powerful call and a great reminder that anytime you grieve and you spend time playing scenarios in your head, again, grieving, processing loss, that's all grief is. Anytime you say you're grieving, you're going to process loss. That's what the word means. It is a loss that has to be processed. We only go through grief when there has been loss. If there has not been loss, there is no need for grief. Grief is the result of us processing loss. But I said to her that when you're in this position, you have to remind yourself that the safest way to move through the bargaining phase of grief is not to focus on the past or worry about the future, because what ifs will create emotions that will keep you trapped in the loop of feeling bad about the situation that you're in. She was incredibly thankful, pleased to say this was about 9 months ago. She's gone through with the divorce. The divorce has been signed and sealed by the judge. She's doing incredibly well. She's an incredible grandmother, and she's really growing. And she really believes she's healed in the areas of her life where she was wounded as a result of this marriage. And I'm incredibly proud of her. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.